It all started during what was supposed to be a routine wildfire evacuation drill until it became very real, very fast. I was in my home office, managing the rerouting of first responder traffic across the Tri-County area when suddenly, my monitors began flashing red. Communications went dark, dispatch screens froze, and the command relay dropped completely. One moment, I was sending updated GPS locations to paramedics navigating through scorched, fire-ravaged terrain. The next, I was staring at an error message that might as well have said, "Good luck, you're on your own." Outside, my dog started barking furiously. I rushed to the utility box by the back fence and there she stood, Karen, fully in her HOA power trip mode, wielding garden clippers with a smug grin sharp enough to spoil milk. She actually bragged about sparing the bushes this time and only cutting what she claimed was a messy cable. What she had really done was slice through a fiber optic line, not just any cable, but one that connected my house to a crucial county-wide emergency coordination hub. At first, Karen didn't grasp the severity of what she'd done, but I felt it hit me like a freight train. She hadn't merely disrupted my internet, she may have endangered lives. Just 2 hours earlier, everything had been calm, clear skies, fresh coffee. I was preparing the communications deck for a standard simulation test. My setup wasn't your typical suburban Wi-Fi router. My home served as a relay node for the county's emergency communication network. It was a reinforced connection designed for disaster scenarios, supported by redundant lines and a dedicated battery backup. My role was straightforward: to keep essential communication alive when all else fails. During fires, floods, storms, or power outages. When disaster strikes, people like me ensure rescue teams stay linked. That morning, I had live feeds streaming from 3 separate county agencies on my secondary monitors. A wildfire had jumped containment in a canyon 30 miles west, and crews were redeploying. I was their eyes and ears until suddenly, I wasn't. At first, I suspected a software glitch. Then, the diagnostics flashed a warning. Fiber uplink severed. My hands went icy cold. This wasn't some casual internet cable. It was part of a secure, county-authorized installation, a one only a handful of people in the area were permitted to touch. I immediately switched to emergency protocols, booting up my backup mesh node and rushing outside to inspect the main junction. There she was, Karen, dressed in her beige windbreaker, clipboard tucked under one arm, standing next to the shredded conduit with garden shears dangling from her wrists like a trophy. She looked at me like I was trespassing on her territory. With an unrepentant tone, she said, "I warned you about those wires. They don't meet community standards." I thought she was joking at first. When I asked if she understood the damage she'd caused, she blinked and replied, "It's just a cable. Your Netflix can wait. You people and your ugly wires ruin the neighborhood's look." I didn't even respond. I turned and sprinted back inside, rerouting traffic through a slow, high-latency satellite link in my backup system, a last resort channel that would have to suffice. I immediately sent a critical alert to county dispatch and re-established minimal routing to mobile teams. Messages trickled in on my screen, one from a fire crew trapped between 2 ridgelines, unable to move; another from paramedics who had missed an evacuation alert. Karen's careless snip had created a 5-minute blackout in communication, and those 5 minutes were enough for chaos to spread. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of apologies, explanations, and a desperate effort to patch together a network never designed to run on duct tape and cellular fallback. When things finally settled, I filed a formal report with the county, complete with timestamps, photos of the damage, and a security camera screenshot showing Karen mid-clip. But this wasn't Karen's first brush with infrastructure. Last month, she fined a neighbor for having solar panels visible from the street. The month before, she threatened to tow a mobile dialysis van parked outside someone's home because it was, in her words, an eyesore. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a problem wrapped in perfume. Quoting HOA bylaws like sacred scripture, her obsession with aesthetics had already pushed 2 families out of the neighborhood. But this time, she'd crossed a line, a legal one. The cable she cut was clearly marked, mapped, and protected under county emergency codes. I expected regret or at least concern. Instead, she doubled down. At the emergency home meeting that evening, Karen arrived armed with a stack of violation notices, insisting my communication gear was unauthorized clutter. She even accused me of installing spyware to eavesdrop on the community. The rest of the board, a mix of passive retirees and folks too polite to speak up, sat frozen like mannequins. Then I dropped the bombshell. I played the security footage. There was Karen snipping the cable, Karen laughing while on the phone, Karen stuffing the severed line into a plastic bag and walking off like she'd just clipped some weeds. And then came the kicker. The cable wasn't just Mania, it was county property, registered and linked directly to emergency response. Her face went stone cold, her hand twitched. Then, in classic Karen fashion, she pivoted. "I never saw that label," she stammered. "No one told me." "It looked just like an old TV wire. It's a misunderstanding." Her voice was shaking, but her gaze remained cold, unrepentant. She wasn't sorry, just calculating. That very night, I was visited by two representatives from the county's Emergency Infrastructure Division. They were composed but clearly concerned. One, a weathered fire services technician, shook his head as he studied the photos. "This could have ended much worse," he muttered. "We'll have to escalate this. Legal might get involved." That's when it hit me. Karen hadn't just caused me inconvenience. She might have broken state-level emergency protocols, violations that carry hefty fines, civil penalties, or even criminal charges under the right circumstances. But Karen was still stuck on her narrow view, literally the view from her porch. Sleep was elusive that night. Part of me was furious, but another part was cautious. Karen wasn't finished. She'd made a mess, but she was sharp enough to know the best defense is a stronger offense. She'd spin this situation as start with emails to the board, spread rumors about me running some illicit tech operation, and try to paint herself as the victim. I needed to be 10 steps ahead, so I put a plan in motion: cameras, logs, backups. If she wanted a battle, I'd give her Onia, not with noise, but with hard evidence, silence, and strategy. And most importantly, with every connection I had in the county's emergency network. Because what Karen couldn't know and couldn't even imagine was that the person whose cable she cut was the one responsible for keeping the entire county online during disasters. If she thought snipping a single wire was the end of it, she was dead wrong. The morning after the cable incident, I found a heavy cream-colored envelope folded neatly in my mailbox. It was an HLA bulletin, topped with Karen's elaborate signature flourish and a floral watermark. The subject line screamed in all caps, "Urgent notice, unauthorized equipment found in community." Below, a lengthy tirade warned residents about possible surveillance devices disguised as utility boxes. She'd included a blurry photo of my equipment, complete with red arrows and circles like a crime board from a low-budget detective show. It was clear her email had been blasted to the entire neighborhood, and she wasn't wasting a second rewriting the narrative. According to Karen's version, I was running a covert spying operation masked as internet hardware. The implication wasn't just absurd, it was dangerous. It didn't take long before I started noticing strange looks from neighbors. One woman who used to wave when I walked the dog now crossed the street to avoid me. A couple I'd helped reset their router just last month wouldn't meet my eyes anymore. Karen's smear campaign had worked. She'd sown just enough out to make people uneasy. That was her tactic. She didn't need to be right, she just needed to be loud. But what she hadn't counted on was how loud I could get, especially when I had the law on my side and the county's entire emergency response team backing me. I reached out to my contact at County Infrastructure, a no-nonsense woman named Dana who had overseen several disaster response projects with me. Dana was furious when she saw Karen's bulletin. She told me she'd already spoken to legal and confirmed that Karen's actions could violate multiple state laws related to tampering with emergency services. This wasn't just a personal dispute, it could be a criminal offense. Dana instructed me to document everything, every message, every meeting, every neighbor who came forward. And so I did. Later that afternoon, I spotted a white pickup truck idling near my house. Two men stepped out, dressed in county inspector uniforms and clutching clipboards. At first, I thought Dana had sent them, but something felt off. One of the men didn't display any visible ID badge, and the other kept glancing at his phone while pretending to inspect the sidewalk. I walked over and asked who sent them. They exchanged uneasy glances before mumbling something about a community complaint. I pressed further. What department? Which division? Their answers grew vaguer. When I asked to see paperwork, they had none. Then I noticed the patch on one man's sleeve. It didn't say anything about the county. Instead, it identified a private security firm. They weren't inspectors, they were hired goons. Karen had taken it to the next level. I called Dana immediately and explained what had happened. She confirmed that no inspection had been authorized for my property, meaning Karen had hired a private company likely connected to the HOA to impersonate officials and snoop on my setup. It wasn't just shady, it was potentially illegal impersonation. We agreed it was time to involve the county attorney's office. But Karen's antics didn't end there. That evening, the HOA sent out another bulletin, this time signed by Karen and 2 other board members. It announced a vote scheduled for the next meeting on a new bylaw, banning non-decorative utility structures in front or side yards. The timing was no accident. She was trying to criminalize my communication system retroactively through neighborhood rules. If passed, she could use HOA hearings and even legal enforcement to target me under community codes. She was planting legal landmines while pretending it was about curb appeal. That's when I realized I needed to fight on multiple fronts. I already had the county's support on the emergency services angle. Now, I had to dismantle Karen's influence within the HOA and the neighborhood. Inside the HOA itself, I began reaching out to neighbors one by one, and not with accusations or arguments, but with facts. I knocked on doors, explaining how the system worked, that it wasn't some kind of spying rig, and how it actually helped support wildfire communications across several towns. I told them about the backup relay I maintained, which kept emergency services running during last year's windstorm. Most of them had no clue. They'd never heard my side. All they knew was Karen's bulletins and had accepted them as truth. One neighbor surprised me. The master Carlos, quiet, ex-military, mostly kept to himself. When I explained what had happened, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You know, she did the same thing to me." I blinked, and he pointed up to his roof in my ham radio tower. Karen claimed it violated height restrictions and tried to get it removed. The catch? He used it for emergency ham operations during hurricane season and had to get FEMA involved to protect it. It was like a light switched on. Karen had a pattern. She didn't just dislike infrastructure, she actively targeted anything she didn't understand. Worse, she timed her attacks during critical, high-risk periods. Over the next few days, more neighbors came forward. A nurse who ran a medical freezer off a generator during blackouts. A firefighter with a thermal imaging camera mounted near his garage. A teacher who'd set up a satellite classroom during COVID lockdowns. Each had felt Karen's wrath but stayed quiet until now. I gathered their stories into a single report and sent it to Dana, who forwarded it to the county investigator assigned to the case. I included timestamps, photos, and recordings from my own incident. The evidence was overwhelming, a clear pattern of obstruction, harassment, and possibly coordinated sabotage. And since Karen had hired a private company under false pretenses, the impersonation angle gave authorities a solid lead to pursue. Still, Karen refused to back down. She escalated by calling a special HOA meeting. The agenda had one item only: disciplinary action against me for failing to comply with home equipment guidelines. When I arrived that night, the room was packed. Karen sat front and center, wearing a cream-colored suit like a judge in a courtroom. She smiled as I entered, and unaware that Carlos was right behind me, along with 4 other neighbors she had pushed too far. The meeting opened with Karen reading a prepared statement accusing me of disrupting community harmony. She claimed my equipment caused distress, lowered property values, and violated the neighborhood's aesthetic spirit. I waited until she finished, then pulled out my phone and played the audio recording of the fake inspectors at my door. The moment they admitted they weren't county officials, the room shifted. Carlos stood up next. Calmly, he described how Karen tried to shut down his federally licensed radio tower during an active emergency response. The tide turned. By the end of the meeting, half the room was murmuring about board overreach. Karen tried to push another vote but failed, and no one seconded her motion. I didn't need to say a word. She was drowning in her own theatrics. The envelope Ruth had handed me sat on my kitchen table like a ticking bomb. I didn't open it right away. I circled it, stared at it, debating whether opening it would make things worse or finally set them right. Eventually, I poured a fresh cup of coffee and sat down as if I were diffusing a live wire. Inside were printed emails, some from Karen, others sent to her. Most had timestamps matching key incidents from the last 6 months. The language was carefully passive-aggressive at first, then growing bolder. One email to a landscaping company asked if they could deal with that strange shed with all the wires. Another mentioned monitoring which houses contributed to aesthetic decay. Karen had highlighted my address 3 times and included a blurry satellite screenshot of my yard. I wasn't paranoid anymore. I was targeted. One email stood out above the rest. It was from Karen to a man I didn't recognize, discussing potential leverage in case the county got too involved. She called him Marcus and said he had contacts in security. My gut twisted. That had to be the same man I'd seen lurking with the fake inspectors. It looked like Karen was manufacturing enough chaos to get me flagged as a risk or nuisance to push me out or discredit my work before the county's next emergency tech contract review. Suddenly, it wasn't just about HOA aesthetics. It was sabotage, deliberate and strategic. I reached out to Dana again and sent her everything. She called back within 10 minutes, her voice low and tight with anger. "This is bigger than a neighborhood dispute," she said. "Marcuso, we've had problems with him before. He tried to bid on a county contract last year to install private response systems, but his tech didn't meet standards. Now, it seems he's creating failure points to discredit our current setup." That's when I realized that this wasn't just HOA drama anymore. It was deliberate sabotage. What struck me most was how personal Karen had made it. She didn't know a thing about my work, mesh relay networks, dual-band emergency comms, none of it. All she saw was a box she didn't like and a person she couldn't control. Now, she dragged someone in who had a vested interest in destabilizing everything I maintained. To Karen, it was just smoke and mirrors, but to Marcus, this was business. He wanted to replace public safety systems with private contracts. If my node failed enough times, he'd swoop in with a solution the county would be desperate to buy. That meant they needed me to fail. I had no choice but to beat them at their own game. Over the next 3 nights, I rebuilt my entire system, and not just patching but fortifying it. I constructed a new server cabinet in my basement with a hidden false panel, rewired my satellite uplink into the gutter line where no one would think to look, and deployed 3 passive surveillance sensors disguised as bird feeders around my property. If they came back, I'd have more than just grainy footage this time. I also reprogrammed my emergency systems to log every signal, every IP address, every ping, even those that failed to connect. If Marcus or anyone linked to him tried another breach, I'd have the digital trail to follow. Then I set the bait. I took an old fiber router, stripped it of its components, and placed it in a bright gray housing box on the side of the house. It was completely useless, but looked real enough. I even ran dummy cables underground, buried just enough to seem legitimate. I marked it with a red sticker that read "Experimental Relay." Then I waited. Not even 48 hours passed before I saw Karen walking her dog, slowly passing by and staring a little too long. The next evening, my motion alert triggered. Someone was in the side yard. The footage was grainy at first, but when the infrared kicked in, there he was, Marcus, crouched next to the box with a toolkit. I let the footage roll. He clipped a cable, looked confused when nothing happened, then walked off. 30 minutes later, my real system detected a remote login attempt from an unregistered MAC address. I logged it, cross-referenced it with county records, and found a match to a known testing device registered to Marcus's defunct company. I packaged everything: a video, login attempts, emails, audio, and sent it to Dana with the subject line, "Your smoking gun." Her reply came fast. "Legal is moving on this now. We're taking it to the state. Tampering with this kind of infrastructure is a felony. You just gave us everything we need." I leaned back in my chair and exhaled for the first time in days. But it wasn't over, and not yet. The very next morning, I woke up to another HOA bulletin. Karen was calling an emergency session. The reason? Community safety concerns about rogue technology operators. She had the nerve to use that phrase. Her flyer included doctored images of my house with ominous red filters. She accused me of experimenting with dangerous frequencies. I wasn't surprised but still shocked at how far she'd go to twist the truth. This wasn't about power lines or curb appeal anymore. This was a war of narratives. What she didn't know was that the county had finally authorized a direct investigation, and not just into the HOA's handling of community infrastructure, but into Karen herself. They were sending a team of legal and technical advisors to attend the meeting. Their role: observe and document silently. I planned to do the same. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was full. People looked tired, confused, some just annoyed that this was cutting into dinner. Karen stood in front of a slideshow, starting her presentation with dramatic music softly playing from a Bluetooth speaker. She showed photos of wires, graphs she didn't understand, and videos spliced together to make me look like a conspiracy nut. She even quoted a fictional ordinance she made up on the spot. I stayed silent through it all. When she opened the floor for discussion, I calmly walked to the projector, plugged in my phone, and played the footage of Marcus tampering with the decoy node. Then the footage of the fake inspectors. After that, I displayed the email with Karen's own words, asking for help to remove me as a problem. The room fell silent. Someone in the back whispered, "Is that legal?" Another muttered, "Didn't she find my kid for having an antenna last year?" Then the county reps stood up, introduced themselves, and quietly informed Karen that she was now under investigation for multiple violations including obstruction, defamation, and conspiracy to tamper with county assets. She stammered, tried to spin it, said she was only trying to protect the neighborhood. No one responded. It was over. As the meeting ended, neighbors quietly approached me, saying thank you. "I'm sorry, we didn't know." Even old man Gradia, the quietest neighbor who never spoke above a whisper, walked up and patted my shoulder. About time someone stood up to her. I nodded, and not smug, not angry, just relieved. The system had held. The truth got out. And the wires were still humming, stronger than ever. But what no one noticed as they filed out into the night was that Karen hadn't gone home. She was parked across the street, lights off, staring at my house like a general who'd just lost a battle but was already plotting the next war. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. The clubhouse meeting had left a mark. People who once ignored each other were now exchanging cautious glances, whispering updates at mailboxes, and sharing clips of Karen's meltdown in group chats that had never even mentioned her name before. The county officials made it clear they were building a case, but their silence after the meeting spoke volumes. Karen wasn't just being watched, she was under investigation. But if there was one thing I'd learned by now, it was that people like her don't back down quietly. They escalate. I was trimming the hedges along my side fence when I noticed a new flyer being stapled to the community board across the street. Another HOA bulletin, but this one came with a bold new twist. Karen wasn't just complaining about aesthetics or safety anymore. Now, she claimed I'd violated the neighborhood's environmental standards. According to her, the underground wiring near my property had disrupted soil quality and caused what she called electromagnetic plant decay. She even cited a fabricated report from some environmental group which, after a bit of digging, I discovered didn't exist. She was making it all up, wholesale. It was so brazen I almost laughed. But I knew what she was really doing, throwing mud, hoping some of it would stick. If the county charges couldn't stop me, maybe she could drown me in endless HOA infractions until I gave up and moved away. Unfortunately for her, the county wasn't messing around anymore. Dana sent me a message saying the legal department had formally escalated the issue to the state's Emergency Operations Division. That meant Karen's actions would now be reviewed not just for civil penalties, but under laws protecting critical infrastructure. What she'd done could land her felony charges if proven deliberate. And the fact that she kept escalating despite warnings only strengthened the case against her. But the process would take time, and Karen wasn't wasting any of hers. That same evening, there was a knock at my door. It was Ruth again, the quiet board member who'd handed me those incriminating emails. She looked pale, shaken. I let her in and offered tea, but she waved it off. She said she had something urgent to show me. Apparently, Karen had gone into overdrive after the meeting. She'd started organizing private HOA security patrols all made up of her most loyal followers. They weren't official, not trained, but they'd begun making late-night rounds with flashlights and clipboards. According to Ruth, they were told to monitor suspicious properties, and mine was at the top of their list. I didn't want to believe Ida until I saw the photos Ruth took from her upstairs window. 3 men, none I recognized, wearing matching beige jackets with makeshift hoe patches, standing near my driveway at 2 a.m., pointing at the relay box by the sidewalk. One of them held a crowbar. That was it. I wasn't just being watched anymore. I was being scoped out for sabotage. I called Dana immediately. She said it was time to involve law enforcement directly. The next day, I met with the county sheriff's department. I handed over security footage, emails, photos, and every HOA bulletin Karen had distributed over the past 2 weeks. The officer I spoke with didn't even try to hide his disbelief. Flipping through the evidence, he shook his head. "You'd think she was running a cartel," he muttered. "We'll handle it." But even he was surprised at how far this had gone. He said they'd send a plainclothes unit to monitor activity around my house at night. He also warned that tampering with critical infrastructure during an active investigation carried serious consequences, especially if she was organizing groups to interfere. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I walked to the edge of the neighborhood and stood beneath the entrance sign with a can of red spray paint. I added one word across the wooden panel beneath the logo: monitored. I wanted them to know I wasn't hiding. Someone was watching back. Sure enough, Karen's patrol showed up again 2 nights later. But this time, a sheriff's deputy was waiting nearby in an unmarked car. When one of the men approached my box with a tool bag, the deputy stepped out, badge raised, and detained all 3 on the spot. Turns out 2 of them had prior records, the one for trespassing, the other for impersonating a city worker. They weren't just Karen's neighbors. They were people she'd hired. The fallout was immediate. Word spread like wildfire. Residents who'd remained neutral suddenly found themselves horrified. Home meetings went from sparsely attended to packed with angry homeowners demanding answers. Karen, for her part, stopped showing up altogether. She claimed she was taking a leave of absence due to stress, but everyone knew the real reason. That same morning, the sheriff's office had executed a search warrant on her home office. Dana confirmed they were now investigating financial records from the HOA treasury. Apparently, some of the patrol expenses had been reimbursed as beautification costs. I should have felt triumphant, but mostly I just felt tired. This woman had tried to destroy my reputation, sabotage county emergency systems, and weaponize an interior. She had tried to tear apart a whole neighborhood just to win a personal crusade, and for weeks, she had come dangerously close to succeeding. But there was one final blow she never saw coming. Just before sunset, a news van pulled up outside my house. A local investigative reporter had caught wind of the story from a public incident report and traced it back to me. She wanted an interview. I hesitated at first, but then I realized, sunlight was the best disinfectant for the kind of rot Karen had been spreading. I agreed. We filmed the segment right there on my front lawn. I walked her through the equipment of the relay system, the role I played in county emergency management. She asked about the sabotage, the fake patrols, the HOA drama. I kept it professional, but the footage spoke for itself. When the story aired, it included the security video of Marcus tampering with the box and screenshots of Karen's own emails. It went viral overnight. The headline was simple: Neighborhood Watch or Neighborhood War? Within 24 hours, county officials issued a formal statement confirming Karen was under investigation for tampering with protected infrastructure and misusing HOA funds. The state's attorney general announced their office would review the case for potential charges. But the biggest twist came in the final seconds of the news segment. A former HOA board member from another city saw the broadcast and contacted the station. He claimed Karen had been removed from her previous board for similar behavior, false reports, harassment, and financial misconduct. She had simply moved here and reinvented herself. As the dust began to settle, my neighborhood started to change. People who had been silent found their voices. A petition circulated to overhaul the entire HOA structure. New candidates stepped up, people who genuinely cared about the community's safety and well-being. I even saw Ruth smile again. Karen didn't vanish entirely. Her house sat dark and empty for a while. Then one day, A moving truck arrived. I watched from my porch as the crew loaded box after box. She never came outside, not once. She left like a ghost, quiet, bitter, and defeated. The neighborhood was finally at peace, but I wasn't just rebuilding a system anymore, I was rebuilding trust, and this time, the wires were stronger, the eyes were open, and the gate never slept. It started like any other morning. I sipped coffee on my front porch, watching the sunrise over a neighborhood that finally felt calm again. No weird patrols, no phony inspectors, no bulletins accusing me of electromagnetic plant murder, just the steady sound of birds and the distant hum of sprinklers. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel charged with paranoia. It felt like a place where normal life might actually be possible. But even in moments like that, I knew better than to get too comfortable. People like Karen never truly go away, they just go quiet, and quiet could mean she was gone for good or that her next move would be her most desperate yet. Still, the weeks that followed were mostly peaceful. Home meetings transformed overnight, the board underwent a total overhaul, and the new leadership wasted no time tearing down Karen's absurd policies. Fake ordinances were rescinded, fines were dismissed. Even the neighborhood Facebook group, once a minefield of passive-aggressive comments and surveillance snapshots, became a place where people shared lemonade recipes and posted about lost cats. It was almost unsettling how quickly things flipped. The community had collectively exhaled and realized just how toxic it had been, and in that breath of fresh air, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. Neighbors started dropping by, some brought baked goods. Others came with handshakes or quiet apologies. A firefighter ride helped during the wildfire response stopped by, handing me a county coin engraved with the words "Resilience in Crisis." A small thing, but it meant a lot. Even kids waved at me again. For a guy who'd been labeled a rogue signal operator just a month ago, that was progress. But while the neighborhood healed, the legal side of things kept moving behind the scenes. I wasn't directly involved anymore, but Dana kept me updated. Karen's actions were serious enough that the case had moved to the state level. Investigators uncovered not only home mismanagement but evidence she'd collaborated with that shady contractor, Marcus. She had knowingly undermined emergency infrastructure, filed false HOA records, and authorized reimbursements for unlicensed patrols using HOA funds. That wasn't just misconduct, it was criminal. Eventually, the charges came down. Dana forwarded me the press release. Karen was facing a mix of misdemeanors and felonies: tampering with critical systems, misuse of community funds, and obstructing a government operation. Her court date was set. Word spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up how the woman who once ran our neighborhood was now the subject of a criminal investigation. Her private kingdom had become the subject of a full state investigation. The same neighbors who once nodded politely as she barked about nonconformity were now staring at their TV screens in disbelief. But what shocked them most wasn't just that she'd been caught, it was how long they had let her get away with it. Then came a moment that felt like poetic justice. One morning, I got a call from a contact at the Emergency Communications Center. He told me my name had been submitted for a statewide recognition award, and not just for my technical support during fire season, but for exposing an ongoing attempt to compromise public safety networks. I was stunned. I never wanted recognition. I just wanted to be left alone to do my job. But that wasn't the world we lived in anymore. Being quiet and competent had almost gotten me erased. Maybe now, being visible wasn't such a bad thing. The awards ceremony was scheduled for a month later at the state capitol. I was hesitant at first. I hated suits and hated speeches even more, but Dana convinced me it was important. Not just for me, but for everyone like me who did the hard, invisible work of keeping things running. People needed to know sabotage could happen anywhere, and fighting back didn't always mean shouting louder. Sometimes, it meant being right, being persistent, and having a system strong enough to outlast the noise. The ceremony was surreal. I stood on a stage surrounded by names I'd only seen on internal reports of fire chiefs, emergency planners, communication leads from across the state. They handed me a plaque, shook my hand, and let me give a short speech. I kept it simple. I spoke about community trust, how the systems we build are only as strong as the people who protect them. I mentioned Karen on Sia, an unnamed force trying to break things she didn't understand. But I didn't need to say her name. Everyone already knew. When I got home that night, the porch light was on and a small crowd had gathered in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors were waving, clapping, holding homemade signs that read things like, "Thanks for keeping us connected," and "Our guy in the wires." Someone even brought a small cake shaped like a Wi-Fi router. It was silly and sweet, and I couldn't stop smiling. That night, I finally believed we had turned the page. But no story about Karen ends without one last twist. 2 weeks after the ceremony, I received a certified letter from an unfamiliar law firm. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a notice of withdrawal. Karen had formally resigned from the HOA, surrendered her property into a trust, and was relocating permanently out of state. But tucked inside the envelope was one last thing, a handwritten note, 4 words, barely legible. "You shouldn't have won." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a final reminder that, to her, this had always been a contest, a game, a power struggle. She never believed she could lose, but she did, not because I fought harder, but because I fought differently. I used evidence, systems, and truth. Most of all, I didn't stop. That was something she could never outmaneuver. Months later, the old clubhouse still stood, but the air inside felt new. The board had changed, the rules had changed, and the people had finally found their voice. I stayed involved not because I liked politics, but because I knew what could happen when people stopped paying attention. I helped draft a technology policy that encouraged innovation instead of punishing it. We installed backup power stations at 3 community sites. The relay box Karen once tried to destroy now had a plaque beside it, honoring its role in keeping emergency services running during the fire. One evening, I passed by Karen's old house. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown, as if nature was reclaiming it. But what struck me most wasn't the silence, it was the absence of fear. No one looked over their shoulder anymore. No one feared a bulletin or a fine for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of gray. Karen had ruled by intimidation, confusion, and chaos where there should have been clarity. Now, clarity ruled. The system worked, the people spoke, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again. As I walked home, I passed the main gate where it all began. The keypad Karen once spray-painted, the wires she tried to cute, all now hidden beneath a new cover plate, hardened, sealed, and monitored not just by me, but by a whole network of watchful eyes who had learned what vigilance really meant. And just above it, nailed to the gate, was a wooden sign. Burned into the surface were 3 simple words that made me stop and smile: "Never cut wires."